Hello, welcome to Mediascope TV. Today our guest is Professor Safwan Masri, who is Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University and the Senior Research Scholar at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. As a scholar on education and contemporary geopolitics and society in the Arab world, Professor Masri's works mainly focus on the historic post-colonial dynamics among religion, education, politics and society. At the end of the last year, he published a book from Columbia University Press entitled Tunisia, an Arab Anomaly. And in this book, he examines why Tunisia was the only country to emerge from the Arab uprisings as a democracy. So today we're going to talk about his recent book and of course the case of Tunisia. So welcome, Professor Masri.
Thank you.
Thanks for accepting our invitation.
My pleasure.
So if you don't mind, first of all, let's begin with the title of your book.
Okay.
So why do you call Tunisia as an anomaly? In which respects Tunisia stands out as an anomaly in comparison with the other Arab countries?
So it's called an Arab anomaly. It's a play on words a little bit, and anomaly, of course, in a positive sense over here, in at least one respect. There are two reasons why I consider it an Arab anomaly. One of them is that it is an anomaly with respect to the rest of the Arab world, because of the trajectory that it has been on, not only since colonialism, but even before colonialism and during colonialism and its relationship with the French colonial power when it was a protectorate of the French between 1881 and 1956. So it has been an anomalous country relative to the rest of the Arab world. And that trajectory explains why it has been able to transition towards the only functioning democracy in the Arab region today, and I'll tell you why that is in a second. But the other reason that I call it an Arab anomaly, in that part of that history of Tunisia positions it as both an Arab country, but also not exclusively Arab. So I argue in the book that it's both within and without the Arab world. And I call into question also the meaning of an Arab world. What does it mean to be part of the Arab world? What is the concept of an Arab nation, which was really a mid-20th century anti-colonial response that I think has failed as a concept very largely. So it's for both of those reasons. It's an anomaly within the Arab world, and it's anomalous to also think of it only as an Arab nation. Now, the reasons why I believe that it has been on a different trajectory than the rest of the Arab world, and what I consider to be the factors that helped it transition towards a democracy. Let's not forget also that the Arab Spring, to the what we call an Arab Spring, the uprising, started in Tunisia, right? And other Arab countries thought that they could have similar results to Tunisia's success in toppling the autocratic president Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali, transitioning towards an electoral democracy, introducing freedoms that are unprecedented in the Arab world, and adopting a secular constitution, the only one in the Arab world. The rest of the region that tried to emulate the Tunisian experience has been at least disappointed, as in the case of Egypt, where we had an experience with democracy that only lasted for 18 months. And then in other places like Syria, Yemen, Libya, we have seen civil strife and humanitarian crises that are of huge proportion and unprecedented since the Second World War. So what are those factors? Why is Tunisia able to get to this point relative to the other countries of the region? And I think there are two categories or two sets of factors. The first set is made up of factors that are very specific to Tunisia, that cannot be replicated elsewhere in the Arab world. Factors that helped Tunisia in its transition toward democracy. Those factors have to do with its geography, and geography has many dimensions associated with it, and its demography, and other things that I will also outline. Its geography being a small country in the Mediterranean, on the Mediterranean, close to southern Europe, with borders that have not changed much in hundreds, if not thousands of years. And the only other Arab country that can claim that kind of geographic integrity is Egypt, right? Everything else has been created more or less after the fall of the Ottoman Empire and at the beginning of the colonial times. Sykes-Picot agreement of 1916 helped define the shape of the Arab world. Tunisia's geography has more or less remained intact. There was a Tunisian nation waiting to become a state post-colonialism in the 20th century. Its distance from the center of the Arab center of gravity in Amman, Damascus, Baghdad, that really defined the geopolitics of the region, inter-Arab intrigue, the Arab-Israeli conflict. Tunisia was sort of spared from being entangled, one, because of its foreign policy, but also because of its distance and its relative insignificance as a small country. Its proximity, as I mentioned, to Europe and being on the Mediterranean has also defined an identity and a civilizational orientation towards the Mediterranean that goes back to the founding of Carthage in the year 814 before Common Era by the Phoenicians, and then its competition with the Roman Empire, its subjugation to the Romans, and then becoming a province of the Roman Empire. You know, from those times, it was a powerful force, whether under the Phoenicians or under the Romans in the Mediterranean, right? So that kind of orientation goes back a very, very long time. So that's on the geographic sort of aspect of things. Demographically, the country is 99% Sunni Muslim. So it is also spared the sectarian tensions that have defined the realpolitik of other countries in the Arab world. It has also benefited from a lack of a resource burden. So the fact that it is not a country that's rich in oil or gas has helped it avoid the foreign interests in the country. And so it has been spared foreign intervention. It did not get entangled in the Cold War and did not really factor in inter-Arab competition, if you will, for power and hegemony in the region. So those factors helped Tunisia. Those factors are very specific to Tunisia. Those factors don't explain the success of the democratic transition, but they certainly were part of sort of the environment that helped in this transition. The factors that had agency, that really mattered, are deeply rooted in a long history of reform that started in earnest at the beginning of the 19th century, when Tunisia was a semi-autonomous province of the Ottoman Empire, which opened up to Europe in the 19th century because of the rise of Europe and the rise of European interests in trade, economic trade, but also trade of ideas, especially with the end of piracy at the beginning of the 19th century, the illegalization of it, and so on. That reform movement was influenced by European European presence in Tunisia, French, British, Italian, but what was also very much related to the Tanzimat that came out of Istanbul, you know, in two waves, under Sultan Mahmud and then under Sultan Abdul Majid and Abdul Aziz. But they were also influenced by local leadership, you know, Ottoman leadership, intellectual leadership, as well as political leadership, that saw a reform in 4 important spheres that gave birth to sort of the nationalist movement for independence in the early 20th century. And so what I argue is that reform in the area of education, reform in the area of religion and the moderation of the role of religion in society, the emancipation of women, and the active role of civil society, that those 4 factors have been present in a very serious way in Tunisia, and elsewhere in the Arab world, the reverse of that has been the prevalent case in much of the rest of the Arab world.
At this point, I want to ask a question about your approach. So you emphasize more the long-term factors contributing to the democratization process of Tunisia rather than short-term factors like events which happened after following the Arab uprisings. So is this one choice among the others, or do you think that this is the best way to explain why Tunisia has democratized?
Well, I mean, you know, in my approach is focusing on the events since the Arab Spring helps me look at the symptoms, helps me look at what has been characteristic of the transition since 2011. So some of the questions I had, how come Tunisians were able to organize so efficiently and so effectively and manage to not only topple their autocratic leader, but also demand and get other gains, such as insistence on constituent assembly elections, which took place in 2011, the same year that they ousted their president. How come they were able to debate, argue, have opposing views about the kind of constitution that they wanted to adopt, and ended up with a comprehensive constitution that they adopted in 2014, okay? How come in 2013, when you had 2 high-profile political assassinations, you had an Islamist party that was in power, okay? When the Islamist party tried to push a certain agenda and failed to do so, and the country entered an era of political deadlock in 2013, 4 civil society organizations came together. They formed what then became known as the Quartet for National Dialogue, that literally saved the day, got the Islamist government to withdraw from governance, and they negotiated a path forward for the country that saw the adoption of the constitution in 2014 and successful parliamentary and presidential elections later in 2014. The quartet was then rewarded with the Nobel Peace Prize in 2015. So my questions were, you know, how come these things happened? You know, what is it about Tunisians that allowed for a peaceful transition, debate, compromise, consensus building, okay, a smooth transition? So you do have to look at what happened since 2011, but what I found is that the answers to those questions lay in the trajectory that the country had been on for a long time, that helped prepare it for this moment. And that trajectory, okay, contrary to common belief, did not start with the nation builder Habib Bourguiba, who was the country's first president from 1956 to 1987. He deserves a lot of credit for his vision for the country. But what was very interesting to me is that what Bourguiba implemented in terms of a secular education, freedom for women and equal rights for women in Tunisia, what he also did in the domain of religion, ensuring that there was a moderation of the role of religion in society, were things that he was able to do because of a great reform movement that had started about a century and a half before his time. Okay. And civic society, which played a very big role in the transition since 2011, and actually in the protests of 2011, because civil society, particularly the Union Générale Tunisienne de Travail, or the labor union, provided logistical and organizational support during the protests between the middle of December 2010 and the middle of January 2011 that resulted in the ouster of Ben Ali. That civil society, in a way, also was a product of the reform movements that had started in the 19th century. The first labor union movement was established in 1926, and one of its co-founders was a reformer who, in 1930, wrote a very important treatise on the importance of women's emancipation. He argued for equal rights for women, and he was a Muslim scholar at the Zaytuna Mosque University. At the time, society was not ready for him, but in 1956, when Bourguiba becomes president, he takes that treatise of the scholar, Tahir Haddad, and codifies it into law. And by doing so, he abolishes polygamy, for example. In 1956, Tunisia abolishes polygamy. Today, in 2018, polygamy is legal in every Arab country for a Muslim. And so the short-term investigation looked at sort of the nature and the characteristics and the dynamics of Tunisian society that I explain in my book through a long-term historical analysis of the factors that have allowed for this kind of dynamic to exist today in Tunisia.
You mentioned the reform process in the 19th century as one factor among others which contributed to the democratization of Tunisia. Do you think that the nation-building process of Tunisia was facilitated by this reform process, and do you think that it created a kind of smooth atmosphere to transition to the nation building?
No question in my mind about that. That the nation building process that happened after independence was facilitated by that reform movement, and that during the colonial era, that reform movement that took place in the 19th century, which saw the implementation of secular education, that saw the beginnings of reform within Zaytuna, which again, is a very important mosque that was a place of great scholarship, that was established in 698. Okay, so it's a very, very old mosque university that predates Al-Azhar of Cairo by 250 years. And actually Al-Azhar was established by a Tunisian. So, Tunisia, Zaytuna's mosque, I think, importance to Tunisia is quite remarkable. So the 19th century, before colonialism, you saw secular education, you saw the beginnings of reform within Zaytuna. You also saw reforms that were unprecedented elsewhere in the Muslim world. Abolitionism, the abolition of slavery, took place in 1846 in Tunisia under Ahmed Bey, the ruler at the time. 2 years before France, 19 years before the United States. In 1857, Muhammad Bey adopts a security covenant, Ahd al-Aman, which gives rights to non-Muslim residents of Tunisia and advances the rights of Tunisian citizens. In 1861, 15 years before Istanbul adopted the Ottoman Constitution of 1876, Tunisia in 1861 adopted the first constitution of any country in the Muslim world. So you had intellectual forces at work, you had reforms in terms of human rights, in the case of abolitionism, you had reforms in terms of education, you had reforms in terms of religion, long before the French colonized Tunisia. Once the French colonized Tunisia, that reform movement that was taking place gave birth to les jeunes Tunisiens, okay, young Tunisians, modeled after the young Ottomans and later on the young Turks. And many of the players and many of the founders of the young Tunisians movement were actually the reformers of pre-colonialism, and those themselves then became the leaders of the nationalist movement for independence. Okay, so there was a continuity in that reform process. It was the same people who were working on reforming Zaytuna Mosque, on introducing secular education, on arguing for the emancipation of women.
Do you think there are similarities in terms of leadership between Bourguiba and Atatürk? Or, of course, differences, because we know that you interpret these two leaders with the dichotomy of rupture and continuity.
Sure. There are great similarities between the two leaders. Atatürk was the quintessential nation builder of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. There's no question about it. He was a man of great vision, who knew what he wanted for Turkey and who knew what he wanted for Turkey in the long run. Bourguiba was a nation builder for a much smaller state. Mm-hmm. He came a little bit after Atatürk, and I think he learned a lot of lessons from Atatürk. So beyond the fact that they were both, albeit different scales of importance, nation builders, they shared a lot of commonalities between them beyond that. They were both determined modernizers. Mm-hmm. They were both also adopters of a laïcité model, mm-hmm. of bringing religion under the control of the state in order to manage its role in society. They both, within a very quick period after, in the case of Turkey, the formation of the Republic in 1923, and in the case of Tunisia, its independence from the French in 1956, unified the judiciary, annulled Waqf, and stopped its funding, brought religion under the control of the state, and both of them also focused very heavily on education for their publics. Now, there are differences in their approaches. Atatürk basically reset Turkey, and he was managing a transition into a republic of a former empire, right? So it had to do with the sort of scaling back of the boundaries of the nation, and changing course, because for 400 or 500 years, Turkey, or Istanbul, let's say, was through during the period of the Ottoman Empire, was looking east, was looking south, was also looking west, and had expanded, let's not forget, well into Europe, but had taken sort of leadership of the Muslim world, right? Atatürk decided to change the orientation of Turkey to the west and to the north, right? And he changed the alphabets, and he made a very determined decision in terms of where Turkey's place in the world was going to look like and what its orientation was going to be like. Bourguiba didn't have that kind of dynamic to deal with, because he did not change an orientation for Tunisia. Tunisia had always been oriented towards the Mediterranean and had always had sort of different civilizational influences. Don't forget that Istanbul was the influencer. It was the power, for hundreds of years. Tunisia had always been a small receiver of civilizational influences that shaped an identity that was Mediterranean, at the same time African, at the same time Arab, at the same time Western, Occidental, Oriental, all of those things. But what resulted at the time of independence was a very confident Tunisian identity that combined all of those things. Okay, there was no resetting involved with this. So Bourguiba, for example, how he dealt with Islam, okay, and how he dealt with an Arab identity, he could not move away from it even if he wanted to. And I'm not suggesting that he wanted to, but certainly compared to others who competed with him in the nationalist struggle, he was far less interested in an Arab Muslim identity than some of his competitors were. But he managed that, he controlled that. He allowed religion, for example, some breathing room in society, and he argued as a religionist. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the similarity between him and Ataturk was that in both of them distrusted a heavy influence of religion in society. Both of them understood that the future of their nations lay in the larger world. Okay, so that's a very strong similarity between the two of them. Both of them implemented some of the same strategies to limit the influence of religion in society. Bourguiba was more accommodating, allowing a little bit of room for religion sort of, exist in the milieu of society, and he had to do that because he understood the significance of that in the culture that he had inherited. Ataturk, I think, was sort of the builder, the transitioner from an empire world into a republic world, was perhaps in a stronger position, and he was able to implement farther-reaching reforms in the young republic.
So one last question about the future of Tunisian democracy. So do you think that can we be hopeful about the future of Tunisian democracy given the domestic and international challenges?
I am hopeful. I'm not predicting the future of Tunisia. I'm trying to explain its history and how come it got to the point that it got to today. The future depends on a lot of factors, some of them internal, some of them external. There are many stresses on Tunisia that make its democratic transition fragile. Those are political pressures and stresses, they are economic, and they are security related as well. I think what happens around Tunisia, in Libya, in Algeria, could impact how things develop in Tunisia. I think the fact that Tunisia, having been spared foreign interests before the Arab Spring, helped it because there was no foreign intervention. Today, that's no longer true. There is foreign intervention. There are countries that are competing for influence within Tunisia, and that, of course, could create some challenges for the country. The biggest challenge is economic, and within the realm of economic challenges, the biggest problem is an old problem of a discrepancy between the interior of the country and the coastal region. And I think how Tunisia deals with that, and how the international community deals with that, and how the international community also deals with aid to Tunisia that is linked to its success in fighting corruption, will also have a great impact. So, you've got all of these things going on, but I do think that given its history, given the ideas that I argue in the book in terms of the importance of a good education system, the importance of a largely secular education system, the importance of human rights and freedoms, particularly when it comes to women's rights. Very, very significantly, the importance of civil society activism. Excuse me. All of these things, I think, have been ingredients that have been in the making for a very long time, are deeply rooted in Tunisian society, and I'm hopeful that those will continue to create the kind of environment that will see success in the long run. Now, in the short term, you're going to have some failures, and a revolutionary moment is a very long moment, and we know that from looking at various examples in modern history, from Latin America in the 20th century back to the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. But I think, from Tunisia, there are very important lessons that can be learned. By looking at Tunisia, one is able to perhaps understand the failures of the Arab world. And by looking at Tunisia, one can perhaps also look for hope in a world that needs hope.
Thank you, Professor Masri.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today our guest was Professor Masri. We talked about Tunisian democracy. Thank you for joining us. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day.